Love stories are never simple. Some blossom in peace, while others are forged in fire. For Julia Trubkina and Brandon Gibbs, their journey was anything but ordinary. What started as a whirlwind romance soon turned into a battle against family expectations, cultural differences, and the pressures of fame on one of reality TV's most talked about shows minus 90 Day Fiance. But what happens when the weight of family disapproval becomes too heavy to carry? What happens when your own mother tells you, "If you don't leave your wife, you are no longer my son"? For Brandon, those words cut deeper than any wound. And for Julia, they became the final straw in a never-ending struggle for respect. Yes, you heard that right. Julia Trubkina and her husband Brandon Gibbs had been struggling with family disputes for a long time. Eventually, they made a difficult decision to sell all their properties, including their house, for $2 million. After the sale, they decided to leave the United States permanently and move to Australia. At the same time, they announced that they would no longer be part of the 90 Day Fiance show on TLC. One of the main reasons behind their family conflict was Brandon Gibbs' mother. Allegations arose that Julia Trubkina was treating her mother-in-law badly. Upset by this, Brandon Gibbs' mother told her son, "Brandon, if you don't divorce your wife Julia Trubkina, then from today you are no longer my son. I will not accept you as my child anymore." Hearing such harsh words from his mother deeply broke Brandon's heart. He realized that the only way to escape this turmoil was to leave everything behind. So, he sold all his property and moved to Australia with Julia Trubkina in search of a new life. Tonight, we dive into the story behind the headlines. A story of sacrifice, betrayal, courage, and the pursuit of freedom. This is the story of Julia Trubkina and Brandon Gibbs. Before the chaos, before the arguments, before the family battles, there was just love. Pure, young, fearless love. Julia Trubkina was a vibrant, free-spirited woman from Russia, full of life and dreams larger than her hometown could hold. Brandon Gibbs was a shy, small-town boy from Dinwiddie, Virginia. He was raised on tradition, on family values, and on the quiet comfort of farm life. No one would have guessed that their paths would ever cross. Yet fate had other plans. They first connected through a mix of chance and destiny. Their early conversations were playful, filled with curiosity about each other's worlds. Brandon was intrigued by Julia's boldness, her confidence, and the way she carried herself like she belonged to no one but herself. Julia, on the other hand, found Brandon's innocence refreshing. In a world where many men played games, here was a man who was genuine, sweet, and perhaps even a little too naive. When Julia agreed to come to America on the K-1 visa, she wasn't just coming for love. She was stepping into an entirely different universe. For Brandon, bringing Julia into his family home seemed like the easiest path while they saved money for their future. For Julia, however, it was a cultural shock she could have never imagined. At first, their love masked the differences. Brandon adored Julia's energy and the way she lit up every room. Julia cherished Brandon's devotion and the way he stood by her side. But behind the smiles and tender moments, shadows began to form. Living on the family farm meant Julia was constantly under the watchful eyes of Brandon's parents, especially his mother. What began as small disagreements, how Julia dressed, how she spoke, how she viewed independence, soon grew into larger conflicts. For every sweet moment Julia and Brandon shared, there was tension brewing in the background. Yet, despite the mounting challenges, one thing was undeniable. Julia and Brandon loved each other deeply. They laughed through language barriers, held each other through misunderstandings, and dreamed together of building a life free from judgment. For Julia, America wasn't home. It was Brandon who was home. And for Brandon, Julia was the first person who made him feel like he could step outside his parents' shadow and claim a life of his own. Their wedding day was proof of that love. Against doubts, against whispers, against criticism, they stood together and promised to fight for each other no matter what. The cameras of TLC captured the smiles, the nerves, and the vows. But what they couldn't capture was the silent hope in their hearts. A hope that love would be enough. But as we'll soon see, love alone doesn't always silence family disputes. And for Julia and Brandon, the road ahead would be filled with battles they never expected. The honeymoon phase of Julia and Brandon's relationship was short-lived. For most newlyweds, marriage begins with freedom. The freedom to explore life together, to build routines, to find balance in love. But for Julia, marriage meant moving not into her own home with her husband, but into her in-laws' house, surrounded by rules, routines, and expectations she never signed up for. The Gibbs family farm was beautiful in its own way. Rolling fields, open skies, the kind of peace you'd expect from rural Virginia. But to Julia, it didn't feel like home. It felt like a cage. Every morning, she woke up not to the promise of independence, but to the reality of being under someone else's roof, someone else's authority. Brandon's parents, particularly his mother, Betty, were strict. They loved their son deeply, but their love often crossed into control. Betty wanted the best for Brandon, but in her eyes, the best meant keeping him close, keeping him obedient, keeping him tied to the farm. Julia represented the opposite of everything Betty valued. She was outspoken, she challenged traditions, she questioned authority. The farm life itself was another struggle. Julia had never worked with animals, never woken up at dawn to feed livestock, never spent hours in mud and dirt, but on the farm, it wasn't optional. There were chores, responsibilities, and expectations placed on her simply because she was now part of the family. At first, Julia tried to adapt. She pushed through the early mornings, smiled through her frustrations, and did her best to keep the peace. But over time, the pressure mounted. To her, it felt less like becoming part of a family and more like being forced into servitude. She wasn't just Brandon's wife. She was suddenly an unpaid farmhand, expected to contribute without complaint. The cameras of 90 Day Fiance captured glimpses of these struggles. But what fans saw on TV was only the surface. Behind the scenes, Julia felt increasingly isolated. The language barrier made it difficult to defend herself in heated moments, and cultural differences widened the gap between her and Brandon's family. Brandon, caught in the middle, felt torn. On one hand, he loved Julia and wanted her to feel supported. On the other, he feared disappointing his parents, who had raised him with strict obedience. For years, Brandon had lived in their shadow, quiet, compliant, avoiding conflict. But with Julia by his side, that old dynamic was being challenged. The tension didn't just affect Julia, it seeped into her marriage. She longed for private moments with Brandon, for romantic dinners, for late-night talks, where it was just the two of them. But in the Gibbs household, privacy was a luxury they didn't have. With walls that carried every word and parents who checked in constantly, Julia began to feel suffocated. Every conversation about independence, about moving out, about building their own life, ended in conflict. Betty insisted they weren't ready financially. She reminded Brandon of his responsibilities, of the practical reasons for staying put. Julia, meanwhile, saw it differently. To her, love without independence wasn't love at all, it was control. It was in those early months on the farm that cracks began to show. Arguments sparked over the smallest things. Julia's clothing choices, her reluctance to do chores, her desire to live closer to the city. Each argument pushed her further away from the idea of family and closer to the idea of escape. For fans watching on TV, it made for dramatic storylines. But for Julia and Brandon, it was their reality. And as weeks turned into months, one truth became clear. Life on the farm wasn't sustainable. If they wanted to survive as a couple, they needed to leave the shadow of the farm behind. But leaving wouldn't be easy, because what Julia saw as freedom, Brandon's mother saw as betrayal. And that clash would set the stage for the explosive conflicts to come. For many couples, reality TV feels like a golden ticket. Fame, recognition, and the chance to share their love story with millions of viewers. It all sounds glamorous on the surface. But for Julia Trubkina and Brandon Gibbs, being on 90 Day Fiance quickly turned into a double-edged sword. When they first appeared on the show, fans were drawn to their dynamic. Julia, with her fiery personality and strong opinions, stood in stark contrast to Brandon's quiet, sometimes awkward demeanor. Their chemistry was undeniable, but so were their differences. TLC cameras captured it all: the sweet moments, the laughter, the kisses, and most of all, the conflicts. But what viewers often forget is that reality TV doesn't stop when the cameras turn off. Once their episodes aired, Julia and Brandon's private life became public property. Every argument was dissected online. Every choice was criticized by fans and tabloids. Every moment of tension between Julia and her mother-in-law was amplified, replayed, and turned into headlines. For Julia, the experience was especially brutal. She was portrayed as the villain by some, too outspoken, too defiant, too unwilling to conform to the expectations of her new family. Social media was flooded with comments calling her ungrateful, disrespectful, even manipulative. Each cruel word stung, adding weight to the battles she was already fighting within the household. Brandon, on the other hand, often came across as passive, someone caught between two forces he couldn't control. While some fans sympathized with him, others criticized him for not standing up for his wife, for being too loyal to his parents, for failing to draw boundaries. In many ways, Brandon was living two realities: the quiet, obedient son his parents wanted him to be, and the protective husband Julia needed him to be. The constant attention made it harder for the couple to resolve their issues privately. Every fight became content. Every disagreement was replayed for the world to judge. And while the fame brought opportunities, interviews, fan events, sponsorships, it also brought pressure. The weight of being a 90-day fiance couple meant they were never truly free to just be themselves. Even everyday life was affected. Going out for dinner meant being recognized. Visiting the grocery store often led to whispers and stares. For Brandon, who had always lived a small-town life, this sudden fame was overwhelming. For Julia, who had left her family, friends, and country behind, it was isolating. Instead of finding comfort in her new home, she often felt like she was on stage, performing a role she hadn't asked for. The show also magnified the tension between Julia and her mother-in-law. What may have been small household disagreements suddenly became national debates. Was Julia being disrespectful, or was Betty being controlling? Was Brandon stuck in the middle, or was he enabling the situation by refusing to choose sides? These questions weren't just being asked in the Gibbs household. They were being asked by millions of viewers across the world. At times, the couple found humor in the chaos. They laughed at memes, joked about fan theories, and even tried to use the attention to their advantage. But deep down, the constant scrutiny chipped away at their relationship. Every move they made was under a microscope, and the pressure was suffocating. For Julia, the biggest pain wasn't the fans or the cameras. It was the fact that her struggles were entertainment. Her tears became ratings. Her anger became hashtags. Her pain became memes. And while the world laughed, she was left wondering, was her marriage strong enough to survive this? The truth was simple. Reality TV didn't create the problems between Julia and Brandon, but it magnified them. What might have been a private disagreement behind closed doors became a national spectacle. And as the seasons went on, the couple realized that being in the spotlight wasn't helping their marriage, it was destroying it. They began to ask themselves a difficult question: was staying on the show worth losing each other? Every family has disagreements, but for Julia Trubkina and Brandon Gibbs, those disagreements became a battlefield. At the center of it all was one relationship that defined their marriage almost as much as their love for each other: Julia's relationship with Brandon's mother, Betty. From the very beginning, Julia and Betty clashed. Betty was protective of her son, perhaps too protective. For years, Brandon had been the quiet, obedient child who rarely rebelled. He worked on the farm, lived by his parents' rules, and never caused trouble. But with Julia's arrival, that dynamic changed. Suddenly, Betty was no longer the most influential woman in her son's life. Julia was. Julia, for her part, wasn't used to being told how to live her life. She had left behind her home country, her independence, and her family to be with Brandon. She expected a partnership, a marriage built on freedom and equality. But instead, she found herself being treated like a guest who needed constant supervision. The conflict started small. Betty didn't approve of Julia's outfits. She had strong opinions about how Julia should behave, what chores she should do, and even how she should plan her wedding. Julia brushed it off at first, trying to keep the peace, but each comment, each demand, each disapproving look added to the growing fire between them. Things reached a boiling point when it came to boundaries, or rather, the lack of them. Privacy in the Gibbs household was almost non-existent. Julia longed for alone time with her husband, but it seemed that every moment was shared with his parents. Their voices carried through the thin walls, their presence loomed over every conversation, and their influence on Brandon was impossible to ignore. For Julia, it wasn't just about privacy, it was about respect. She wanted to be seen as Brandon's wife, not as an outsider living under his parents' roof. She wanted to make decisions with her husband, not have those decisions dictated by his mother. And every time she tried to assert herself, Betty pushed back harder. Fans of 90 Day Fiance watched these clashes unfold on screen, often taking sides in the fiery debate. Some saw Julia as disrespectful, unwilling to adapt to her new culture and family. Others saw Betty as overbearing, unwilling to let go of her son and allow him to grow into a husband. What the cameras couldn't fully capture, though, was the emotional toll these battles took on the couple. Brandon was caught in the middle. On one side was his mother, who raised him, supported him, and expected his loyalty. On the other was his wife, who left everything behind for him and needed his protection. No matter what he did, someone would be hurt. His silence often made things worse. To Julia, it felt like betrayal. To Betty, it felt like proof that she was right. The arguments grew louder, more personal, and more painful. Words were exchanged that couldn't be taken back. Julia was accused of being manipulative, of trying to drive a wedge between Brandon and his family. She, in turn, accused Betty of controlling her husband and refusing to accept her as part of the family. What had once been small cracks in the relationship became deep fractures. Dinner conversations turned into shouting matches. Family gatherings ended in tears. And with the cameras rolling, every fight became immortalized on national television. Behind the scenes, Julia began to feel trapped. She loved Brandon, but she couldn't see a future where she would ever be accepted by his family. For her, the dream of marriage was quickly turning into a nightmare, and for Brandon, the pressure of choosing between the two most important women in his life was breaking him apart. The tension wasn't just about cultural differences or misunderstandings anymore. It was about power. Who controlled the household? Who controlled Brandon? Who had the final say in their lives? For Betty, the answer was clear. She did. For Julia, that was unacceptable. This battle between wife and mother-in-law wasn't just a subplot in their marriage. It was the defining struggle, and it was only a matter of time before the situation would reach its breaking point, forcing Brandon to make the most painful choice of his life. Every conflict has a turning point, a moment when the tension can no longer be contained, when harsh words spill out like poison, and when relationships are changed forever. For Julia Trubkina and Brandon Gibbs, that breaking point came in the form of bitter allegations and an ultimatum that no family should ever face. As the weeks on the Gibbs farm dragged on, Julia's patience wore thin. She had tried to adapt, to contribute, to respect the household she was living in. But no matter what she did, it never seemed good enough. Betty's disapproving glances grew sharper. Her tone became colder. The tension in the air was suffocating. The heart of the conflict lay in how Julia treated her mother-in-law, or at least, how Betty perceived it. Small disagreements, like Julia refusing to do certain farm chores or resisting house rules, were twisted into accusations that she was disrespectful, ungrateful, and even cruel. The whispers began. Relatives, neighbors, even fans online fed the fire. Betty would tell Brandon that Julia had no respect for family values, that she only cared about herself, that she was tearing the family apart. Some even accused Julia of turning Brandon against his own blood. Julia, of course, denied these claims. She was outspoken, yes. Independent, yes. But cruel? Never. In her eyes, She was simply setting boundaries. Boundaries that had never been respected since the day she arrived in America. What Betty called disrespect, Julia called self-respect. What Betty called disobedience, Julia saw as survival. But the accusations stuck. They replayed in Brandon's mind late at night, when the farm was quiet and Julia was asleep beside him. He loved his wife, but he also loved his family. And now, those two loves were colliding in the most painful way. One evening, the tension boiled over into a confrontation that would forever change their lives. Betty, frustrated and angry, confronted her son directly. Her words cut deep, sharper than any blade. "Brandon, if you don't divorce your wife Julia Trubkina, then from today you are no longer my son. I will not accept you as my child anymore." The room fell silent. Brandon's world collapsed in that instant. The woman who had raised him, cared for him, and been a constant presence in his life was now demanding he choose her or Julia, family or wife, blood or love. Julia stood frozen, stunned by the cruelty of the words. She had endured insults before, but this was different. This wasn't just rejection, this was exile. A declaration that she was an enemy, not a daughter-in-law. Brandon's heart broke in two. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. His mother's ultimatum replayed in his head like an echo he couldn't silence. He loved Julia, but how could he bear the thought of losing his mother forever? How could he stand against the woman who had given him life? For Julia, the answer was clear. If Brandon truly loved her, he would stand by her side, no matter the cost. For Betty, the answer was just as clear. Julia was destroying her family, and Brandon had to choose where his loyalty truly lay. The following days were some of the darkest in their marriage. Brandon withdrew, caught in the unbearable weight of the decision before him. Julia, feeling betrayed and unwanted, questioned whether she had made a mistake in coming to America at all. And Betty, firm in her stance, refused to compromise. The allegations that Julia mistreated her mother-in-law, that she was selfish, that she didn't belong, were no longer whispers. They were weapons. And those weapons had wounded everyone in the family. This was the breaking point. The moment when reconciliation seemed impossible. The moment when love itself was tested by the cruelest demand. Choose me or lose me. For Brandon, the choice would change everything. And in the end, his decision wouldn't just end the conflict. It would end life as they knew it. For Brandon Gibbs, family had always been the cornerstone of his life. Growing up on the Virginia farm, he was taught that loyalty to his parents came above all else. His mother, Betty, had guided him through every step, his childhood, his career decisions, his personal life. To many, Brandon appeared as the obedient son who never strayed too far from the nest. But now, everything had changed. Julia Trubkina had entered his world like a storm, beautiful, fierce, unafraid to speak her mind. She challenged him, encouraged him to stand on his own, and showed him a love that was both liberating and consuming. And yet, that same love had placed him at odds with the woman who raised him. The ultimatum Betty delivered, "Divorce your wife, or you're no longer my son," hung in the air like a curse. It wasn't just a demand. It was a declaration that shook the very foundation of Brandon's identity. For days, Brandon barely spoke. He wandered the farm in silence, carrying the weight of the impossible choice on his shoulders. Julia tried to reach him, tried to remind him that love was supposed to be their anchor, but the pain in his eyes told her everything. He was torn between two worlds, and whichever path he chose, a part of him would be lost forever. Julia, though hurt, remained resolute. She had left everything behind to be with Brandon, her country, her family, her career. To be treated like an enemy, like someone unworthy of love and acceptance, cut her deeply. Yet she refused to beg for approval. Julia knew her worth. She wasn't going to sacrifice her dignity to appease someone who had never respected her. But the silence between her and Brandon was louder than any argument. Every glance carried unspoken fear. What if he chose his mother? What if this ultimatum ended everything they had fought for? Meanwhile, Betty stood firm. To her, This was about saving her son from what she saw as manipulation. She believed Julia had poisoned Brandon's loyalty, turning him against the very family that had raised him. The farm was her legacy, and in her mind, Julia threatened to rip it apart. Betty wasn't just asking Brandon to choose a wife or a mother. She was asking him to choose between tradition and independence, obedience and freedom. One evening, Brandon sat alone in the quiet of his room. He replayed his mother's words again and again, his heart aching with every echo. He imagined a future without Julia, lonely, suffocating, filled with regret. Then he imagined a future without his family, isolated, branded a betrayer, cut off from the land and life he had always known. Tears filled his eyes as the truth became clear. No matter what choice he made, he would lose something precious. But deep down, he also knew something else. Love wasn't supposed to be conditional. A mother's love shouldn't come with ultimatums. And a wife's love shouldn't be sacrificed to satisfy someone else's control. That night, Brandon took Julia's hand and whispered the words she had been waiting for. "I choose you. No matter what it costs, I choose you." Julia's heart swelled with relief and sorrow all at once. Relief, because Brandon had finally stood by her side. Sorrow, because she knew what it meant. His decision would sever ties that could never fully be repaired. The next morning, Brandon delivered his choice to his parents. The confrontation was explosive. Betty wept, shouting that Julia had stolen her son. Ron, Brandon's father, tried to mediate but struggled to calm the storm. Brandon's voice shook, but his resolve was steady. For the first time, he wasn't just the quiet, obedient son. He was a husband choosing his partner over the shadow of control. From that moment, the divide was permanent. Brandon knew he could never return to the way things were. His parents' disappointment hung over him like a heavy cloud, and the farm, once a symbol of stability, now felt like a prison he had finally broken free from. The ultimatum had forced a decision, but it had also lit the path forward. Brandon and Julia realized that the only way to save their marriage, to truly find peace, was to leave everything behind. The farm, the house, the family ties, even the country. And so, with heavy hearts and unwavering resolve, they began to plan their escape. When Brandon Gibbs finally made his choice, choosing Julia over his mother, he thought he would feel relief. He thought the weight would lift from his chest, that the silence in his mind would finally quiet. But instead, what he felt was heartbreak. It was the kind of heartbreak that doesn't come from losing a lover, but from losing a family. The farm that had once been his sanctuary now felt haunted by memories of his parents' disappointment. Every corner, every field, every wall carried the echo of his mother's ultimatum. "You are no longer my son." Brandon had always been the good child. He followed the rules, avoided trouble, and made decisions that kept his parents proud. Now, for the first time in his life, he was the source of their anger, their grief, and their shame. He had chosen his wife, yes, but in doing so, he felt like he had betrayed the very people who gave him life. Julia saw the pain in his eyes. At night, when they were finally alone, she would reach for his hand and whisper reassurances. "You did the right thing. Love shouldn't come with conditions." But even her words couldn't erase the sorrow etched into his face. For Julia, it was a bittersweet moment. On one hand, Brandon had finally proven his loyalty to her, something she had long doubted when he wavered under his parents' influence. On the other hand, she carried guilt. Guilt that she was the reason Brandon's relationship with his parents had shattered. She never wanted to be the wedge between him and his family, but circumstances had forced her into that role. The days that followed were heavy with silence. Brandon no longer felt welcome in his childhood home. Meals were strained, conversations cut short, glances filled with disappointment. Even Ron, usually calmer than Betty, couldn't hide his disapproval. Brandon felt like a stranger in the place he once called home. The pressure began to take a toll on him physically. He lost sleep, his appetite waned, and he often wandered the farm aimlessly, unsure of where he truly belonged. Julia tried to support him, but she too was hurting. She wanted to start fresh, to escape the constant judgment, but she also feared the scars his parents' rejection would leave on him forever. And then came the whispers from outsiders. Neighbors who had once smiled at Brandon now looked at him differently. Some sided with his parents, believing Julia had manipulated him. Others pitied him, convinced he had thrown away family for fleeting love. For Brandon, every stare felt like another reminder of the rift he couldn't repair. Still, amid the pain, something shifted inside him. For the first time, he was beginning to understand what independence truly meant. Choosing Julia hadn't just been about love. It had been about finally stepping out from his parents' shadow. The heartbreak was unbearable, but it was also awakening. Late one night, after another argument with his mother, Brandon sat beside Julia on their bed. Tears rolled down his cheeks as he confessed the truth. "I can't live like this anymore. I can't keep fighting between you and them. If we stay here, it'll destroy us." Julia nodded, her own eyes glistening. She knew he was right. The farm, the house, the constant tension. It wasn't just hurting their marriage, it was breaking Brandon piece by piece. That was the moment the idea became clear. They wouldn't just move out. They wouldn't just put distance between themselves and the farm. They would leave everything behind. The thought was terrifying. Leaving meant starting over from scratch. Leaving meant abandoning not only family, but also the life Brandon had known since birth. Yet, it also meant freedom. Freedom from the ultimatum. Freedom from the farm. Freedom from the constant cycle of pain. Julia whispered softly, "Then let's go. Let's leave all of this. Just you and me." Brandon squeezed her hand, his heart breaking but also healing in that instant. For the first time, he saw a future not defined by family control or reality TV drama, but by the love they shared. The decision wasn't final yet, but the seed was planted, and soon, that seed would grow into a plan that would change their lives forever. Selling everything, walking away, and chasing a new life far beyond Virginia. The farm had become unbearable. Every sunrise brought not peace, but tension. Every dinner table conversation was heavy with silence, or worse, words that cut like knives. For Julia and Brandon, life in Virginia was no longer life at all. It was survival. The ultimatum still lingered in the air like a storm cloud: divorce or lose your family. Brandon had made his choice. He chose Julia. But choosing her came at a cost he had never imagined. His parents' love felt conditional. Their home no longer felt like home. And his own heart was breaking from the constant tug-of-war between past and future. One evening, after yet another day filled with glares and cold shoulders, Julia and Brandon sat together in their small bedroom, the place that had become their only refuge. The dim light from the lamp cast long shadows on the walls, making the room feel even smaller, more suffocating. Julia looked at Brandon, her voice steady but full of emotion. "We can't live like this anymore. It's killing us both. If we stay here, we'll lose everything: our love, our happiness, our future." Brandon lowered his head, his hands trembling slightly. He knew she was right. He had been clinging to the hope that things might change, that his parents would soften, that peace could return. But deep down, he knew better. His mother's words had been final, her stance unmovable. There was no compromise, no reconciliation. The only path forward was to leave. But where would they go? How would they start over? These questions circled Brandon's mind like vultures. He had lived in Virginia his entire life, tied to the farm, tied to his family. Leaving meant cutting those ties forever. Julia, however, saw it differently. To her, leaving wasn't the end, it was the beginning. She leaned closer, her voice filled with determination. "We don't need this farm. We don't need their approval. We just need each other. We can start fresh, somewhere new, somewhere far away from all of this." Her words sparked something inside Brandon, a flicker of hope amid the sorrow. He imagined a life beyond Virginia, a life where he and Julia could walk the streets without whispers, without judgment, without family control hanging over them. He imagined freedom. The more they talked, the clearer the plan became. It wouldn't be enough to simply move out of the farm. The family's shadow would always loom nearby. They needed a complete break, a clean slate. That meant selling their property, saying goodbye to everything they had built in America, and leaving the country altogether. It was a terrifying thought, but also liberating. Brandon felt a mix of fear and excitement, fear of the unknown, but excitement for the possibility of finally living life on his own terms. Julia's eyes lit up with the same fire that had drawn him to her from the very beginning. For her, this wasn't just about escape, it was about rebirth. They began discussing where they might go: Europe, Canada, back to Russia. But one destination stood out above the rest: Australia. Why Australia? Because it represented distance. It was as far from Virginia and from the pain of the past as they could possibly go. It was a place where no one knew them, where the drama of 90-Day Fiance and the whispers of small-town neighbors couldn't follow. A place where they could build a life not defined by reality TV fame, but by love. The decision wasn't made overnight. They wrestled with doubts, weighed the risks, and faced the financial realities. Selling their property was no small step. It meant letting go of the last anchor tying them to the United States. But the more they thought about it, the more certain they became. Brandon finally said the words that sealed their fate: "Then we leave. We sell everything, we walk away, and we never look back." Julia smiled through tears, relief flooding her chest. For the first time in a long time, she felt hope. She leaned against him, whispering, "This is our chance. Just you and me. A new life." The path ahead would not be easy. They would face criticism, judgment, and the pain of saying goodbye. But they had chosen love over fear, freedom over control. And soon, they would take the first step toward their new life, selling their $2 million property and leaving America behind forever. Selling a home is never just about money. It's about memories, roots, the walls that hold laughter and tears. For Julia Trubkina and Brandon Gibbs, selling their property wasn't just a financial transaction. It was a symbolic farewell to everything they had built in America and everything they were leaving behind. When they first purchased the house, it had felt like a fresh start. It wasn't the family farm, and that alone made it precious to Julia. It represented independence, the first true step toward carving out a life away from constant scrutiny. She decorated the rooms with her own style, filled the kitchen with laughter, and dreamed of raising a family within its walls. For Brandon, it was proof that he could step away from his parents' shadow and stand on his own 2 feet. But now, the walls felt different. What was once a sanctuary had become a reminder of all the pain, the fights, the family rifts that had led them to this point. Walking through each room, Julia couldn't help but feel the bittersweet sting of goodbye. She ran her hands over the countertops, the walls, the furniture, silently acknowledging the life that could have been. Brandon, too, was heavy with emotion. This was more than just property. It was the last physical link to his American identity. By selling it, he knew he was closing a chapter of his life that could never be reopened. Yet he also knew it was the only way forward. To truly begin again, they had to let go. When they listed the house, interest came quickly. The market was strong, and their property was worth a fortune. Within weeks, they had a buyer willing to pay $2 million, a staggering number that filled them with both relief and sorrow. Relief, because it gave them the financial means to start over in Australia. Sorrow, because the sale made their departure final. The day of signing the paperwork was one Julia would never forget. Dressed simply, with her hair pulled back and her heart pounding, she watched as Brandon signed the documents that officially severed their ties to the home. His hand trembled slightly as he wrote his name, each stroke of the pen echoing like a goodbye. As the realtor congratulated them, Julia and Brandon exchanged a look, half smile, half tears. The check in their hands was more than just money. It was freedom. Freedom from the past. Freedom from the farm. Freedom from ultimatums. Yet as they walked out of the office, Brandon couldn't hide his heartbreak. "It feels like I'm giving up everything I've ever known," he whispered. Julia squeezed his hand, her voice firm. "You're not giving up, Brandon. You're choosing us. You're choosing our future." Those words stayed with him. Slowly, the weight of sorrow lifted, replaced by determination. They were no longer bound by a house, by family expectations, or by the toxic cycle they had endured. They were free to dream again. The last visit to the house before handing over the keys was the hardest. Julia walked through each room, pausing to reflect. She remembered the first night they moved in, sitting on the floor with pizza boxes, laughing about how empty the space was. She remembered arguments, reconciliations, and quiet moments of peace. She remembered dreaming of filling the rooms with children's laughter one day. Brandon lingered in the backyard, staring at the sky. He thought of his childhood, of the life he once thought he'd have in Virginia. And then he thought of Australia, a land so far away, so unknown, but full of possibility. When they closed the door for the last time, it wasn't just wood and brick they were leaving behind. It was the version of themselves that had suffered so much, fought so hard, and endured so many battles. With every step away, they moved closer to rebirth. As the moving truck pulled away, Julia leaned against Brandon's shoulder, whispering, "This is it, our real beginning." And with $2 million in their pocket and nothing tying them down, Julia and Brandon turned their eyes toward the horizon, toward Australia, and toward the promise of a new life waiting just across the ocean. For most people, leaving the United States is simply a matter of travel, packing suitcases, checking passports, booking flights. But for Julia Trubkina and Brandon Gibbs, saying goodbye to America was not a vacation. It was a farewell, a final chapter closing on a life they could no longer live. The decision to sell their property had made their plan real, but it wasn't until the boxes were packed, the tickets booked, and their closest friends hugged one last time that the full weight of it hit them. They weren't just moving, they were leaving everything behind, forever. Brandon's emotions were tangled. As he stood in the quiet of their nearly empty home, he could feel the ghosts of his past everywhere. The laughter of childhood sleepovers, the smell of fresh-cut grass from summers on the farm, the long evenings spent working alongside his father. These memories clung to him, refusing to let go. But alongside them came the darker memories, the endless arguments, the sting of his mother's ultimatum, the crushing weight of being torn between two loves. And in those moments, he reminded himself, leaving wasn't betrayal, it was survival. Julia, meanwhile, felt a different kind of sadness. America had never truly embraced her. She had faced judgment, criticism, and alienation from the very beginning. Yet, in her own way, she had also built pieces of happiness here. She had fans who admired her strength, friends who supported her, and memories of first love with Brandon in places she had once considered foreign. Saying goodbye was bittersweet, because even in a place where she felt unwelcome, she had still carved out moments of joy. Their departure didn't go unnoticed. Some friends supported them wholeheartedly, celebrating their courage to start over. Others were confused, even critical. "Why Australia?" they asked. "Why so far away?" But Julia and Brandon knew the answer deep in their hearts, because it was the only way to truly break free. The hardest goodbye, however, was to the life they had dreamed of in America, the life they once thought would be theirs. A house, a family, stability. The vision had shattered, but acknowledging it still brought pain. On their final day, Julia and Brandon took one last walk through their town. They visited the diner where they'd had late-night meals, the park where they'd walked hand in hand, the small places that held pieces of their love story. Every step was a farewell. When they finally arrived at the airport, the reality of it all sank in. The buzz of travelers around them, the announcements over the loudspeakers, the weight of their luggage. It was all ordinary, yet for them, it was monumental. Brandon paused at the gate, his eyes scanning the familiar surroundings one last time. "I never thought I'd leave," he whispered. Julia squeezed his hand, her voice steady. "Sometimes we have to let go of the old to build something new." As they boarded the plane, Julia looked back through the terminal window, watching the lights of America fade in the distance. A mixture of relief and grief washed over her. She wasn't just leaving a country, she was leaving years of struggle, years of judgment, years of pain. Brandon, too, felt the heaviness. Yet beneath it was a spark of hope. For the first time in his life, he wasn't tied to the farm, to family obligations, or to anyone else's expectations. For the first time, he was free to choose his path. And he had chosen Julia. When the plane finally lifted off the ground, their hearts raced. Below them, America stretched out like a patchwork of memories, some sweet, some bitter. Ahead of them, across the ocean, was Australia. A blank canvas, a chance to rebuild. Julia leaned against Brandon's shoulder, whispering, "Goodbye, America. Hello, freedom." And with that, their past slipped further and further away, until it was nothing more than a distant memory. For millions of fans, Julia Trubkina and Brandon Gibbs were more than just a couple on TV. They were characters in a story that unfolded week after week on 90 Day Fiance. People tuned in to watch their clashes with family, their cultural differences, their fiery arguments, and their tender reconciliations. But for Julia and Brandon, life on TLC had become a burden they could no longer carry. At first, the cameras had been exciting. They felt like celebrities in their small town. Interviews, social media followers, the thrill of knowing their story was being watched around the world. It was surreal. But as time went on, the glamour faded, replaced by something far more destructive. Every fight was amplified. Every disagreement was edited into a headline. Every vulnerability was dissected by strangers. Julia, in particular, bore the brunt of it. She was painted as the defiant outsider, the difficult wife who clashed with her mother-in-law. Fans labeled her disrespectful, even toxic. She scrolled through comments filled with insults, feeling the sting of being judged by people who had never met her. Brandon, meanwhile, was portrayed as indecisive, weak, a man torn between his wife and his parents. Online debates raged about whether he was a mama's boy or simply a husband trapped in an impossible situation. The criticism ate at him quietly, fueling the anxiety and heartbreak he already carried from the real-life conflicts at home. The truth was harsher than what appeared on screen. What audiences saw was only a fraction of the real turmoil. The constant filming meant there was no escape. Arguments that might have been resolved privately became public drama. Painful moments weren't just lived once. They were replayed on national television, then relived again through clips, memes, and articles online. Julia once confided to Brandon late at night, "It feels like our marriage isn't ours anymore. It belongs to them, the producers, the fans, the world. We don't even get to decide what parts of our lives matter. They decide for us." That realization weighed heavily on both of them. The show wasn't just documenting their struggles, it was fueling them. Producers pushed storylines, encouraged conflict, and highlighted every flaw. And while the ratings soared, their relationship cracked under the pressure. The breaking point came after the sale of their home. As Julia and Brandon prepared to leave the US, TLC reached out with another proposal: continue filming their next chapter, this time showcasing their move abroad. To the network, it was perfect drama. A young couple abandoning America, a rift with family, and a fresh start in Australia. To Julia and Brandon, it felt like a trap. Brandon hesitated. The exposure meant money, and part of him wondered if sharing their story might help them rebuild financially. But Julia was firm. She had given enough of herself to the cameras, enough of her pain to the public. She didn't want their new beginning to be another storyline for others to consume. Her words were sharp, but honest. "If we take them with us, we'll never be free. Australia has to be ours, not TLC's, not the fans, not anyone's but ours." Brandon looked into her eyes and knew she was right. For too long, they had allowed producers and viewers to dictate their narrative. This move wasn't about drama. It wasn't about ratings. It was about survival and about reclaiming their lives. Together, they drafted a statement for their fans. Simple, direct, and heartfelt, it read, "After much thought, we've decided not to continue our journey on 90 Day Fiance. We're grateful for the love and support, but it's time for us to focus on our marriage and our future, privately. Thank you for being part of our story." When the announcement hit social media, reactions poured in. Some fans were devastated, others supportive. Comment sections filled with debates, praise, and criticism. But for Julia and Brandon, the noise no longer mattered. For the first time in years, their lives belonged to them, and no one else. The choice to walk away from 90-day fiance was one of the hardest they had ever made, but also one of the most freeing. It symbolized everything they wanted for their future. A clean slate, a story untold, a love not judged by strangers. As they shut down the cameras for the last time, Julia whispered with relief, "Finally, it's just us again." And with that, they closed the door not only on the show, but on the version of their lives that had been lived under the spotlight. Ahead of them lay Australia, unwritten, unfilmed, untouched by anyone else's control. The plane ride to Australia felt like the longest journey of Julia and Brandon's lives, not just because of the hours in the air, but because of what it represented. Each mile that passed beneath them was another mile further away from the life they had known, from the pain they had endured, from the ultimatum that had shattered their family. By the time the wheels touched down in Sydney, they were no longer just husband and wife. They were survivors of a storm, arriving in search of peace. The moment they stepped off the plane, a wave of warm air hit them. It smelled different, felt different, carried with it a strange mix of salt from the ocean and the hum of a bustling new city. For Julia, it was exhilarating. She had always dreamed of living somewhere vibrant, colorful, alive with energy. Australia was all of that and more. Brandon's feelings were more complicated. He looked around at the unfamiliar faces, the strange accents, the sheer distance from everything he'd ever known. He felt a pang of fear, fear of the unknown, fear of starting over with no safety net. But when Julia's hand slipped into his, her smile wide and full of hope, his fear softened. He reminded himself why they were here: freedom, love, a chance to build something new. Their first weeks in Sydney were filled with discovery. The couple rented a small apartment near the city centre, a modest place compared to the Virginia home they had sold, but to them, it was priceless. It was theirs. No parents hovering, no cameras filming, no ultimatums hanging over their heads, just four walls and the promise of independence. Julia embraced the new life with her usual fire. She wandered through markets, tried new foods, explored the beaches, and soaked in every detail of her new home. She shared photos online, but this time, it wasn't for fame or drama. It was for joy. Her captions were filled with gratitude. Finally free, finally us. Brandon took longer to adjust. He missed the familiarity of Virginia, the rhythms of the farm, the comfort of routine, even the small-town quiet he had once found stifling. But slowly, the city began to charm him. Early morning walks along the harbor, the kindness of strangers who welcomed him without judgment, the way the skyline sparkled at night. It was different, but it was good. One evening, as they sat together on Bondi Beach, watching the waves crash against the shore, Julia turned to him with a soft smile. "Do you feel it? The silence?" Brandon frowned slightly. "Silence?" Julia nodded. Back there, everything was noise. The fights, the judgments, the cameras. Here, it's just us. No one telling us who to be. Brandon took a deep breath, listening. And she was right. For the first time in years, the silence wasn't heavy. It was peaceful. Of course, starting over wasn't without challenges. They had to navigate visas, find work, and build a community from scratch. Some nights, doubts crept in. Had they made the right decision? Was it foolish to abandon everything for a dream? But each time those doubts surfaced, they reminded themselves of one simple truth. Staying in America would have destroyed them. Australia wasn't just a choice. It was their only chance to save their marriage. Slowly, piece by piece, their new life took shape. Julia began connecting with local dance studios, rediscovering a passion she had put on hold for too long. Brandon found work in hospitality, a far cry from the farm, but one that gave him structure and independence. Their days were filled with hard work, but also with laughter, exploration, and love. The things they had once feared were slipping away. Fans back in the United States followed their updates with mixed emotions. Some cheered them on, celebrating their bravery. Others criticized, accusing them of running away. But Julia and Brandon no longer cared. For the first time, they weren't living for anyone else's approval. As months passed, Australia began to feel like home. Their small apartment filled with warmth, photos on the walls, laughter in the kitchen, dreams whispered late at night. They talked about the future, children, careers, maybe even buying a home one day. The fear that once haunted Brandon's heart was slowly replaced with pride. He had made the hardest decision of his life, and now he could see why it mattered. Standing together on the balcony one night, watching the city lights shimmer, Julia leaned against him and whispered, "We didn't just move, Brandon. We survived. We chose each other. And now, we're free." Brandon wrapped his arm around her, smiling softly. For the first time in years, he felt peace. The heartbreak of Virginia was still a scar, but in Australia, those scars didn't define him. What defined him was the woman at his side and the life they were building together. And so, with every sunrise over the Sydney skyline, Julia and Brandon stepped further into their new beginning. The pain of the past would never fully disappear, but here, in this new land, love was stronger than the shadows they had left behind. Australia was more than just a new country for Julia and Brandon. It was a reset button. For years, their marriage had been defined by battles, with parents, with producers, with public opinion. But here, far from Virginia and far from the cameras, they were finally free to ask themselves a simple question: who are we without the noise? The answer came slowly, in small, everyday moments. At first, the silence between them was unfamiliar. Back in America, arguments and outside voices had filled the space between them. Now, in their modest Sydney apartment, it was just the two of them. They cooked meals together, explored the city streets, and talked late into the night. Conversations that once felt impossible, about their dreams, their fears, their hopes, now flowed naturally, without interruption. Julia, who had often felt unheard in Virginia, finally felt like she had Brandon's full attention, and Brandon, no longer pulled in two directions, was able to listen, to reflect, and to grow into the husband she always believed he could be. Of course, rebuilding wasn't easy. The scars of the past still lingered. There were nights when Brandon would grow quiet, the weight of his mother's words haunting him. "If you don't divorce her, you are no longer my son." Julia, too, sometimes struggled with guilt. Guilt that she had been the catalyst for the rift. Guilt that Brandon had lost so much because of her. But instead of letting those wounds fester, they faced them together. They talked openly about their pain, their regrets, their what-ifs. And in doing so, they began to replace the bitterness of the past with understanding. Brandon admitted that for too long, he had been passive, afraid to upset his parents, afraid to stand fully beside his wife. Julia admitted that her fiery nature, while a strength, sometimes made her quick to fight rather than compromise. These conversations weren't easy, but they were honest, and honesty became the foundation of their new life. One of the first things they did in Australia was establish boundaries that had never existed before. No parents interfering, no producers dictating storylines, no social media controlling their choices. Their marriage was theirs alone. That independence became a source of empowerment, and with it came a new rhythm. Brandon found confidence in small victories, navigating the city, building a routine, securing work. Each step forward reminded him that he was capable of standing on his own. Julia thrived in the freedom of expression Australia offered her. She reconnected with her love for dance, joined a local studio, and rediscovered the joy of movement, creativity, and community. Together, they created traditions of their own. Weekend trips to the beach, quiet evenings cooking Russian dishes Julia loved, while Brandon learned the recipes with enthusiasm, exploring new parts of Sydney, sometimes getting lost, but always laughing their way back. These weren't just activities. They were building blocks of a marriage that had finally been given space to breathe. Still, there were challenges. Money was tight at first. Building new careers from scratch in a foreign country wasn't easy. The distance from family weighed heavily on Brandon, even if the relationship with his parents was fractured. Julia, too, sometimes felt the ache of homesickness for Russia, missing the familiar sounds of her language and the comfort of old traditions. But each time hardship threatened to pull them down, they reminded each other why they were here. They had left America not to escape, But to rebuild, every obstacle was a test, and every time they faced it side by side, their bond grew stronger. One evening, sitting on the balcony of their apartment, Julia turned to Brandon with tears in her eyes. "You know," she said softly, "for the first time since I came to America, I don't feel like I'm fighting anymore. I feel like I'm living." Brandon squeezed her hand, his voice steady. "And for the first time, I feel like I'm not hiding anymore. I'm just me, with you." Those words marked a turning point. They weren't just surviving together anymore. They were thriving. Their marriage, once on the brink of collapse, was being rebuilt brick by brick, on trust, on communication, and on love untainted by outside interference. In Australia, Julia and Brandon found what they had been searching for all along. Not perfection, not a fairy tale, but peace. And in that peace, their marriage was reborn. Life after reality TV is something few stars prepare for. The lights fade, the headlines move on, and the fans who once watched every moment of your life suddenly turn their attention to the next couple, the next drama, the next season. For Julia Trubkina and Brandon Gibbs, stepping away from 90 Day Fiance meant stepping into a silence they had never known before. At first, that silence was disorienting. They were used to cameras capturing their every move, producers calling for updates, fans sending messages of love and hate in equal measure. Overnight, all of that disappeared. Their social media accounts grew quieter. Interviews stopped coming. They were no longer Julia and Brandon from 90 Day Fiancé. They were just Julia and Brandon, two people trying to make a life together in Australia. For Julia, the change was both liberating and strange. She had always been portrayed as fiery, outspoken, even controversial on the show. Now, without editing or outside commentary, she was free to simply be herself. She poured her energy into her passions, dancing, fitness, and exploring her new city. She began sharing snippets of her life online, not as a TV star, but as a woman who had survived criticism and found her own voice. Her posts reflected a new tone, less defensive, more joyful. No longer trying to prove herself to the world, Julia shared pictures of sunsets over Bondi Beach, videos of her dancing, and heartfelt reflections about the lessons she had learned. Fans who still followed her noticed the difference. "You look happier now," one comment read, and for the first time, Julia felt that was true. Brandon's transformation was quieter, but just as profound. He had always been painted as indecisive, caught between his wife and his parents. But in Australia, he discovered a version of himself that had never been allowed to exist before. Working jobs that gave him independence, making decisions without parental oversight, and standing by Julia without hesitation. These experiences built his confidence. For the first time, he wasn't defined by what others expected. He wasn't the farm boy. He wasn't Betty's son. He wasn't the indecisive husband. He was simply Brandon, hardworking, loyal, and finally, in control of his own life. Yet, with the freedom came challenges. Fame had once provided income and opportunity, and without it, they had to work harder to establish stability. Gone were the TLC paychecks and sponsored appearances. Now, their income came from regular jobs. Julia teaching dance and fitness classes, Brandon managing shifts in hospitality, and slowly exploring other career options. Some days, the transition was tough. Bills piled up, and the glamorous image of TV life felt far away. But strangely, those struggles made them stronger. Each dollar earned felt like a victory. Each small success, securing a rental, paying for a holiday trip, building a small savings account, felt like proof that they were carving out something real. Their identities also shifted in ways they hadn't expected. In America, they were constantly characters. People approached them in grocery stores, debated their choices online, and judged them based on what the cameras showed. In Australia, most people didn't know who they were. They could sit in a cafe without whispers. They could argue without fear it would end up on TV. They could be anonymous. At first, Julia found the anonymity strange, like a spotlight had been turned off too suddenly. But soon, she realized it was a gift. She didn't have to perform anymore. She didn't have to defend herself to strangers. She could finally breathe. For Brandon, anonymity was a relief from the start. The quiet suited him. Without the constant pressure of being watched, he flourished in small ways, picking up hobbies, focusing on his work, and learning to enjoy life without judgment. Of course, there were moments when they missed parts of the fame. The recognition, the opportunities, the excitement of being part of something bigger than themselves. But whenever doubts crept in, they reminded each other why they had left. TLC had given them exposure, yes, but it had also nearly cost them their marriage. And in the end, saving their relationship mattered far more than staying in the spotlight. Who were Julia and Brandon now? They were no longer reality TV stars. They were no longer the controversial couple America debated about online. They were two people rebuilding from the ground up. Two people who had chosen love over fame, peace over conflict, and authenticity over performance. One night, sitting on the balcony of their apartment, Julia asked Brandon quietly, "Do you ever miss it? The cameras, the show, the attention?" Brandon thought for a long moment, then shook his head. "I don't miss being a character. I like being just us." Julia smiled, leaning against him. For the first time, they weren't defined by others, they were defining themselves. And that, perhaps, was the greatest transformation of all. For Julia and Brandon, leaving America had been a painful but necessary choice. For his parents, however, it was a wound that cut deep, a decision they saw not as independence, but as betrayal. When news of their departure reached the Gibbs household, the reaction was swift. Betty, who had already drawn her line in the sand with her ultimatum, felt both vindicated and heartbroken. In her eyes, Julia had finally succeeded in pulling Brandon away completely. What she had once feared, that Julia would sever the bond between mother and son, had come true. Betty's words, spoken in anger before, now hardened into belief. "I warned him. I told him if he chose her, he'd lose us. And he did." Ron, quieter but equally wounded, struggled to hide his disappointment. He had always tried to play peacemaker, to soften Betty's sharp edges and to remind Brandon of his responsibilities. But now, with his son gone across the world, even he felt abandoned. The silence that followed was louder than any argument. Weeks turned into months without phone calls, without updates, without even a simple "I'm okay." For Brandon, reaching out felt impossible. How could he call the people who had told him he was no longer their son? For his parents, picking up the phone felt like giving in, like admitting defeat. And so, the silence grew, widening the chasm between them. Relatives whispered, neighbors talked. Some sympathized with Brandon, admiring his courage to follow love and break free. Others shook their heads, repeating the story that Julia had manipulated him, that she had destroyed a once close family. Each rumor, each whisper, added fuel to the fire of resentment. Julia felt the weight of the blame most heavily. Though she had long accepted that she would never be fully welcomed into the Gibbs family, she hadn't expected the depth of their rejection. She often wondered late at night if Brandon regretted it all, if he wished he had chosen family instead of her. But Brandon always reassured her, his words steady even when his heart ached. "I chose you because you're my family now. That's what marriage means. And I don't regret it." Still, the pain was undeniable. For Brandon, holidays were the hardest. Christmas came and went without a phone call from his parents. Birthdays passed without a message. The traditions that had once been so deeply rooted in his life were now gone, replaced by an empty space that no new celebration could fill. At times, anger replaced sorrow. Brandon would replay his mother's ultimatum in his head, the harshness of her words, the finality of her demand. He would wonder why love had to come with conditions, why family bonds had to be tested by ultimatums. And each time, the anger reminded him why he had left, because love shouldn't feel like chains. For Julia, anger came too, but hers was mixed with frustration. She couldn't understand why a mother would push her own son away, why a family would rather lose him than accept the woman he loved. To her, it wasn't just about cultural differences or misunderstandings. It was about pride, control, and a refusal to let go. Yet, amid the silence and anger, there was also sadness. Brandon often thought of the simple moments he once shared with his parents, the comfort of a home-cooked meal, the laughter during farm chores, the security of knowing his family was close. Those memories haunted him in Australia, reminding him of what had been lost. Back in Virginia, Betty sometimes sat in Brandon's old room, staring at the empty bed. She would tell herself she had done the right thing, that a mother had to protect her son, even from himself. But deep down, when the house was quiet, she felt the emptiness too. The betrayal, as both sides saw it, ran deep. For Brandon's parents, betrayal meant leaving the farm, leaving the family, and choosing Julia. For Brandon, betrayal meant being forced to choose in the first place, being told that love had conditions, being stripped of the acceptance that should have been unconditional. This fracture was not just a fight. It was a scar, and while time might soften the pain, the betrayal would always linger in the background, shaping every choice and every memory. For Julia and Brandon, the silence of family rejection was both a burden and a reminder. A burden because it weighed heavy on their hearts. A reminder because it solidified why they had left. To build a life where love was not conditional, where family meant support, not ultimatums. As Julia once told Brandon one quiet evening in Sydney, "They may see us as traitors, but I see us as survivors. We chose love over fear, and that's something no one can take away." Brandon held her hand tightly, knowing that though his heart still carried the ache of family betrayal, his future lay in the woman beside him, and in the life they were building together. For most fans, 90 Day Fiance was entertainment. It was a weekly dose of drama, romance, laughter, and conflict. Viewers tuned in to escape their own lives, to watch other couples struggle with love across borders. But for Julia Trubkina and Brandon Gibbs, it wasn't entertainment, it was their life. And long after the show ended, the costs of that exposure stayed with them. At first, being on television seemed like a dream. Julia remembered the rush of recognition when strangers noticed her in public, the excitement of gaining thousands of social media followers overnight. Brandon, quieter by nature, found it overwhelming but flattering. For a while, they enjoyed the perks, free invitations, small endorsements, and the thrill of being part of something that people around the world were talking about. But what no one prepared them for were the consequences. The show magnified every flaw in their relationship. Producers were skilled at creating storylines that highlighted conflict. Julia's fiery independence was contrasted against Betty's controlling personality, while Brandon was cast as the timid husband trapped in between. To fans, it was entertainment cold. To Julia and Brandon, it was exhausting. Julia became the target of endless criticism. Online forums tore apart her every word, her every outfit, her every facial expression. She was labeled disrespectful, manipulative, ungrateful. Even when she defended herself, her words were twisted into memes, gifs, and soundbites. Brandon, too, was criticized, though differently. Viewers called him weak, a mama's boy, incapable of standing up for himself or his wife. He saw strangers online debating his masculinity, his loyalty, even his worth as a partner. For a man who had always struggled with confidence, those comments cut deeply. The constant public judgment seeped into their marriage. Arguments they might have worked through in private became public spectacles. Instead of focusing on resolving issues together, they found themselves reacting to the opinions of fans, the edits of producers, and the narratives the show pushed forward. Even after quitting the show, the shadow of 90 Day Fiance followed them. Strangers would approach them in public, asking invasive questions about their marriage. Social media remained a battleground, with comments ranging from supportive to vicious, and the stereotypes created on television stuck with them, even when they no longer reflected reality. The cost wasn't just emotional, it was financial. While fans assumed reality TV brought in big money, the truth was different. TLC paid enough to attract participants, but not enough to build lasting wealth. Julia and Brandon realized quickly that fame didn't equal fortune, and when the cameras stopped rolling, so did the paychecks. The mental toll was perhaps the heaviest of all. Julia developed anxiety, constantly fearing how people would perceive her. She second-guessed her words, her actions, even her personality. Brandon became more withdrawn, avoiding conflict to the point of silence, terrified of being judged as weak once again. In Australia, far from the world of TLC, they finally had the space to reflect on what the show had taken from them. Julia confessed one night, her voice breaking. "Sometimes I feel like they stole our story, like our love was never really ours, it was theirs." Brandon nodded, his expression somber. "They turned our lives into a performance, and the worst part is, we let them." Those conversations were painful, but necessary. They began to realize that while 90 Day Fiance had given them fame, it had also nearly destroyed their marriage. The cost of being known by millions had been their privacy, their peace, and their sense of control. But in that realization came strength. In Australia, they worked to rebuild their identities, not as reality TV stars, but as individuals. Julia leaned into her passions, creating a new life defined by her own choices. Brandon found pride in building a stable routine, free from the constant spotlight. Together, they reclaimed what had once been taken from them, the right to define themselves. Still, the scars remained. Even years later, they would occasionally stumble upon old clips online, comments from fans debating their choices as if they were fictional characters instead of real people. The past couldn't be erased, but now it no longer defined them. The hidden costs of reality TV fame were heavy, but Julia and Brandon carried them with resilience. They had paid the price, but they had also earned something more valuable: freedom. And in that freedom, they found the chance to rewrite their story, not for cameras, not for ratings, but for themselves. When Julia Trubkina and Brandon Gibbs announced their move to Australia, the 90 Day Fiance fanbase reacted with intense and divided opinions. Supporters celebrated their decision as a brave act of self-preservation, flooding their social media with messages praising Julia for standing her ground and Brandon for choosing his wife. They saw the couple as an inspiration for choosing love despite family conflict and public scrutiny. However, critics were equally vocal, accusing Julia of being manipulative and Brandon of being weak for leaving his family. They predicted the move was a mistake and the marriage wouldn't last. Some fans were caught in the middle, saddened by the family estrangement, but understanding their need for peace. This online storm followed them abroad, a constant echo of the conflict they left behind. Over time, the public attention faded, allowing them to find the quiet life they sought. They ultimately learned a crucial lesson. They didn't need the world's approval, only the courage to live life on their own terms together. For Julia Trubkina, moving to Australia was more than a relocation. It was a test of resilience. She had left behind not just a house and a country, but years of conflict, criticism, and rejection. In Sydney, she was determined to rebuild not only her marriage, but herself. At first, the adjustment wasn't easy. Though Julia was fearless on the outside, inside she battled uncertainty. Australia was a world away from both Russia and America. She spoke the language, but cultural nuances sometimes made her feel out of place. She struggled with the paperwork for residency, with the bureaucratic red tape of visas and permits, with the sense that everything was harder without family or connections to lean on. Money was another challenge. The $2 million house sale gave them a cushion, but Julia knew it wouldn't last forever if they didn't rebuild their income streams. She took on small jobs at first, helping at fitness studios, teaching private dance lessons, even working in retail when opportunities arose. Each role came with its own set of challenges, but Julia approached them with determination. Still, there were days when doubt crept in. Alone in their apartment, she sometimes wondered if she had made the right choice. She thought about Russia, about the family she missed, about the life she might have had if she hadn't chosen this path. She thought about America, too, not with nostalgia, but with lingering bitterness. The comments, the insults, the never-ending scrutiny still haunted her. But then she reminded herself, she was not the same woman who had stood powerless in Virginia. She had survived criticism, survived rejection, survived ultimatums. Australia wasn't a setback. It was a chance to prove, to herself most of all, that she was stronger than everything she had endured. Her breakthrough came when she fully committed to dance again. Julia had always loved performing, but her dreams had been overshadowed by family battles and the constant demands of reality TV. In Sydney, she walked into a local dance studio and introduced herself as simply Julia. Not Julia from 90 Day Fiance, not Julia the controversial daughter-in-law, but Julia the dancer. That decision changed everything. Within weeks, she was teaching beginner classes, sharing her passion with students who admired her confidence and energy. For the first time in years, she felt truly in her element. On the dance floor, no one judged her for her accent, her past, or her marriage. They judged her for her skill, her dedication, her artistry, and she thrived. Her confidence grew. She began posting dance videos online, not for fame but for joy. Slowly, her following grew, not fans of reality TV, but people inspired by her talent and her resilience. Julia realized she didn't need a television show to define her. She could write her own story. Of course, struggles remained. She faced setbacks, classes with low attendance, moments when bills piled higher than her income, times when loneliness gnawed at her. But each challenge became a stepping stone, and each triumph, no matter how small, felt monumental. Brandon watched her transformation with awe. He had always admired Julia's strength, but in Sydney, he saw a version of her that even she didn't know existed. She was softer in some ways, more reflective, but also fiercer, more determined to protect the life they had chosen. One night, after she returned home from a long day at the studio, Brandon hugged her tightly and whispered, "I've never been prouder of you. You didn't just survive, you're thriving." Tears welled in Julia's eyes because she knew it was true. For the first time since leaving Russia, she felt whole again. She wasn't the villain in someone else's story. She wasn't the subject of cruel comments or the target of blame. She was Julia Trubkina, dancer, teacher, survivor, wife. Her journey wasn't about erasing the past. It was about reclaiming her identity, piece by piece. And in Australia, far from the chaos of Virginia, Julia had finally found the space to do it. The struggles had shaped her, but the triumphs defined her. And as she looked out over the Sydney skyline each night, she knew she had made the right choice. She had chosen love. She had chosen freedom. But most importantly, she had chosen herself. For Brandon Gibbs, Australia was both a wound and a remedy. Leaving Virginia meant abandoning the farm, his childhood, and his parents. The silence that followed was deafening. Gone were the familiar routines of farm life, replaced by the unfamiliar sounds of Sydney. The absence of his family, especially his mother, felt like a profound loss, and guilt over his decision often haunted him. Julia became his anchor, reminding him that love shouldn't come with conditions. He found purpose in a new job in hospitality, where he was valued simply as Brandon, not as a son or a TV personality. For the first time, he experienced true independence. Healing required facing his past. Through therapy, Brandon confronted years of suppressed emotions, the pressure of obedience, the weight of his mother's ultimatum. Slowly, he began to shed the passive version of himself that had always avoided conflict. Quiet moments with Julia, walks along the harbor, mornings on the balcony, became small acts of rebuilding a life on their own terms. Julia noticed the change. He stood taller, laughed more freely, and spoke with new confidence. One evening at Bondi Beach, Brandon finally put his feelings into words. "I miss them, but I don't regret leaving. If I had stayed, I would have lost myself, and you." His healing wasn't about forgetting the past, but about redefining himself. No longer just Betty's son or a reality TV character, he was finally becoming Brandon Gibbs, his own man, learning to live with his scars and healing day by day. In the quiet stability of Australia, Julia and Brandon finally shifted their focus from the conflicts of the past to the possibilities of the future. For the first time, they could imagine building a family of their own, one defined by love and freedom, not control and conditions. Their dream began with quiet conversations about children. Julia envisioned a strong, outspoken daughter, while Brandon imagined teaching patience and calm. The idea of parenthood, once terrifying under the shadow of his parents, now felt like a hopeful and healing prospect. It represented a chance to create the unconditional love they had fought so hard to secure. Their vision extended beyond the family. Brandon explored new career paths, seeking a more fulfilling profession, while Julia dreamed of opening her own dance studio, a space for creativity and resilience. Though fears lingered about raising children without extended family, their shared resilience reassured them. They had already overcome the impossible. Building a new future was a challenge they were ready to face together. As Julia leaned against Brandon on their balcony overlooking Sydney, she whispered, "This is what we fought for, not just to be free, but to build something better." Brandon agreed, his voice filled with certainty. "Our family will be different. Our family will be ours." In that moment, their dreams transformed from ideas into a solemn promise for the future. No matter how far they flew, no matter how deeply they planted themselves in Australian soil, America still lingered in Julia and Brandon's hearts like a ghost. It was a country filled with both love and heartbreak, opportunity and loss. And even though they had sworn to move forward, the question was inevitable. Would they ever go back? For Brandon, the question was the most painful. America wasn't just a place. It was his childhood, his parents, the farm, the life he had once believed would be his forever. Leaving had been like tearing out a piece of himself, and the scar still burned when he thought about it too long. Sometimes, late at night, Brandon admitted his longing to Julia. "I miss the smell of the farm after the rain. I miss the quiet roads. Sometimes, I even miss them, even after everything." Julia would listen quietly, knowing the ache in his voice wasn't about regret. It was about memory. For Brandon, America was never just about conflict. It was also about roots. For Julia, the question carried a different weight. America had never felt like home to her. From the day she landed in Virginia, she had been under scrutiny, from Brandon's parents, from fans, from strangers who judged her every move. She had fought harder than anyone to carve out space for herself, and still, she had been cast as the outsider. When asked if she'd ever return, her answer was sharp, almost instinctive. "Why would I? That place never wanted me. My home is wherever we are together, not there." Still, even Julia felt the complexity of the choice. America had been where she and Brandon's story began. It was where they had fought, loved, cried, and grown. And as much as she wanted to forget the pain, she couldn't deny that part of her life had been shaped there. Practical questions also weighed on them. Returning to America would mean facing Brandon's parents again. Could those wounds ever be healed? Could bridges that had been burned so completely ever be rebuilt? The answer wasn't simple. On some days, Brandon dreamed of reconciliation. He imagined walking back onto the farm, not as the obedient son of before, but as a man who had chosen his own path. He imagined introducing his parents to a future grandchild, showing them the life he and Julia had built. On other days, the thought of seeing them again filled him with anger. Anger at the ultimatum, at the rejection, at the years of silence. For Julia, reconciliation felt impossible. She had been painted as the enemy for too long. Too many words had been said, too much damage done. She'd often told Brandon firmly, "If we go back, it can't be for them. It has to be for us, because I can't live for their approval anymore." Beyond family, the country itself carried mixed emotions. America offered opportunities, familiar systems, career options, financial possibilities, but it also carried the weight of their past life, a life neither of them wanted to repeat. Australia was freedom. America was a reminder of chains. Friends back in the US sometimes urged them to visit. Fans messaged, asking if they'd ever return for appearances, reunions, or even just visits to old haunts. Julia and Brandon often gave vague answers, knowing that even stepping back for a short trip could reopen wounds they had worked so hard to heal. Yet deep down, they knew the truth. Never was a long time. One evening, as they walked along Sydney's darling harbour, the question surfaced again. Brandon turned to Julia, his voice uncertain. "Do you think, maybe one day, we'll go back? Not to live, but to visit?" Julia paused, looking out over the water. Her voice was softer than usual. Maybe, if we're strong enough, if it's on our terms, not theirs. Brandon nodded, understanding what she meant. Returning wasn't about geography, it was about power. If they ever went back, it wouldn't be as the broken couple forced into ultimatums. It would be as the survivors who had chosen love over control. For now, the answer was simple. Australia was home. The US was the past. Whether or not they would ever return remained a question for the future, a question that carried both hope and fear. But one thing was certain, if they ever did go back, it would be together. And this time, they would walk in not as victims of circumstance, but as authors of their own story. Every choice leaves a mark. For Julia Trubkina and Brandon Gibbs, the decision to sell their home, leave America, and begin a new life in Australia wasn't just a chapter in their personal journey. It was a turning point that shaped how they would be remembered, how they saw themselves, and how others saw them. At its core, their legacy was about courage. Few couples could endure what they had faced: a family ultimatum, public judgment, and the crushing weight of reality TV fame. Fewer still could have walked away from it all: the cameras, the money, the familiarity of home. To start over from nothing on the other side of the world. Their choice was bold, painful, and filled with uncertainty. But it was also undeniably brave. For their fans, the legacy was mixed. Supporters saw them as an inspiration, a couple who proved that love could survive even the harshest storms. Julia became a symbol of resilience, a woman who refused to bow to control. Brandon became a symbol of growth, a man who learned to stand tall, even when it meant breaking away from his parents' expectations. Critics, however, saw the opposite. To them, their move was proof of every negative stereotype: that Julia was manipulative, that Brandon was weak, that abandoning family was unforgivable. Online forums still debated their motives long after their departure, dissecting every detail of their lives like an unfinished novel. But Julia and Brandon knew the truth. Their legacy wasn't about pleasing the world, it was about saving themselves. The legacy also rippled into their families. For Betty and Ron, their son's departure was a wound that might never fully heal. In their community, whispers continued. Had they pushed too hard, or had Brandon betrayed them? The farm carried on, but the absence of their only son left an emptiness no routine could fill. For Julia's family in Russia, the legacy was different. They admired her strength from afar, proud that she had chosen her own path even when it was filled with obstacles. To them, she wasn't just a daughter who married abroad, she was a fighter who carved her own destiny. In Australia, their decision shaped a different kind of legacy, one built quietly, far from the spotlight. They became a couple known not for scandal, but for resilience. Neighbors saw them as hardworking, supportive, and determined. Friends saw them as loyal and genuine, free from the masks that they had once been forced to wear on television. But perhaps the greatest legacy was within themselves. For Brandon, the decision marked the moment he finally grew into his own man. No longer defined by his parents' control or by the image of a timid farm boy on TV, he embraced a new identity: husband, partner, survivor. His choice to stand by Julia, even when it cost him everything, became the cornerstone of his personal growth. For Julia, the decision solidified her identity as a woman who refused to be silenced. She had endured insults, rejection, and judgment, but she had emerged stronger. By leaving America, she proved, to herself most of all, that she was more than the villain the cameras had made her out to be. She was a woman capable of building a life on her own terms. Together, their decision left behind a simple but powerful lesson. Sometimes love means sacrifice. Sometimes survival means walking away. And sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is choose peace over comfort, freedom over familiarity, and love over fear. As Julia once told Brandon while watching the sun set over Sydney's skyline, "Our past will always follow us, but our future, that's ours to create. That's our legacy." Brandon smiled, his hand tightening around hers. For once, he didn't feel like the boy caught in the middle. He felt like a man who had chosen, and chosen well. Their legacy wasn't the house they sold, the show they left, or the country they abandoned. It was the life they built after. The life that proved love could endure even when the world said it couldn't. Looking back, Julia and Brandon sometimes wondered what if, but reflection taught them that every painful twist had led them exactly where they were meant to be. Their story was always about crossing borders, between countries, cultures, and loyalties. They had crossed them all. For Julia, reflection meant reclaiming her power. She remembered the judged young woman, but now saw a survivor who had thrived. For Brandon, it meant accepting the loss of his family while embracing the man he had become, one who could finally choose himself. Together, their reflections were bittersweet. They had lost the familiar but gained something priceless: freedom, authenticity, and a marriage forged not in ease, but in fire. Their love had survived ultimatums, fame, and betrayal, proving that love isn't about perfect circumstances, but about choosing each other again and again. As Julia whispered one evening overlooking the ocean, "Love belongs to us, and as long as we choose it, nothing else matters." Their story was no longer confined to a TV show or a farm. It was bigger, a love beyond borders, tested and scarred, but unbreakable. Julia Trubkina and Brandon Gibbs' story was never a fairy tale. It wasn't simple, it wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't free from pain. But that's what makes it powerful. They faced ultimatums no child should hear, criticism no spouse should endure, and the relentless spotlight of reality TV. They lost a home, a family, and the comfort of the life they once knew. But through it all, they chose love. Again and again, even when the world told them to walk away, they held on. Their decision to leave America wasn't just about selling a house or boarding a plane. It was about breaking free from chains of control, from toxic expectations, from the judgment of strangers. It was about declaring that love, at its purest, belongs only to the two who choose it. In Australia, far from the cameras and the noise, Julia and Brandon found something they had been searching for all along: peace. They rebuilt not only their marriage, but themselves. They proved that love is not defined by where you come from, but by where you are willing to go together. Their story reminds us all of a simple but powerful truth. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away. Walk away from pain, from judgment, from the places and people who refuse to accept you. Not because you don't care, but because you care enough about your future to fight for it. Julia and Brandon's love is not perfect, but it is real. It is resilient, and it is proof that love, when chosen again and again, can survive even the fiercest storms. So, as the waves crash along the shores of Sydney, and as the lights of America fade behind them, their story becomes more than just another reality TV drama. It becomes a lesson, a reminder, a legacy. Love beyond borders, love beyond fear, love beyond judgment. No more today. What are you thinking about this gossip today? Let us know in the comments, and stay tuned by subscribing to our channel to get more updates like this. Thank you.